Welcome back to Beyond the Ages, where we uncover the truths that empires buried beneath their monuments. Today, we're stepping into the shadows of the Roman arena, into a world the poets never wrote about and the senators never discussed in daylight. What you're about to hear isn't found in your textbooks. It's the story Rome told itself to forget. The roar fades. 50,000 voices that shook the Colosseum now disperse into the Roman afternoon like smoke. The sand is dark with blood. The victor raises his sword. The crowd loves him. They always love the victor. But as the spectators file out, talking about what they saw, about the thrust that ended it, about the fallen warrior in the dirt, another story begins. One that happens when the gates close. One that Rome never carved into marble. You wouldn't have seen her in the crowd. She wasn't there to watch. She was below, in the hypogeum, the maze of tunnels beneath the arena floor where the machinery of spectacle lived and breathed. Captured 3 weeks ago when her village resisted Roman expansion. A barbarian, they called her, property of the state. The iron shackles on her wrists were still new enough to cut. The torchlight flickered against stone walls that wept moisture. Somewhere above, the crowd was cheering. Down here, there was only the sound of chains and distant gates grinding open. This is where the performance ended and the system began. Rome built the greatest entertainment empire the ancient world had ever seen, but spectacle was never just about entertainment. It was about power. It was about reminding every person in those seats who controlled life and death, who decided fates, who owned the world. The gladiators were products, the prisoners were inventory, and the women, the female captives taken in Rome's endless wars, they existed in a category the empire preferred not to name in public. The historical record is careful here, deliberately careful. Roman writers like Seneca described the blood, the combat, the philosophical questions about violence and virtue. They debated whether the games were too cruel or necessary for Roman character. But when it came to what happened to female prisoners, to the enslaved women who moved through the same system that produced gladiators, the sources go quiet. Not silent, just quiet. They use passive constructions. They reference rewards for victorious fighters. They mention the presence of female slaves in gladiatorial schools without explaining what that presence meant. The silence wasn't accidental, it was architectural. Roman society operated on a foundation of slavery so total, so normalized, that approximately 1 in 3 people in Italy were enslaved. The distinction between person and property was absolute in law, non-existent in practice. Enslaved people had no legal protection from their owners. None. And female slaves occupied the most vulnerable position in this hierarchy. They could be used in any way their masters desired. This wasn't a secret or a scandal. It was Roman law. It was how the world worked. You're standing in the cells now, in that space between the performance and the night. The stone is cold. The air smells like iron and unwashed bodies and fear. You can hear the gladiators being led away, the ones who survived, champions, heroes to the crowd. You hear their voices, loud with the euphoria of not dying today. Their handlers praise them. There are promises of wine, of meat, of rewards for their victory. The lanista, the owner of the gladiatorial school, is already calculating profits. A winning gladiator is worth more, can command higher fees for the next game, should be kept satisfied, motivated. That's how you manage violent men trained to kill. You give them things they want. The system was economic before it was anything else. Gladiators were investments, expensive ones. They required training, feeding, medical care, housing. A good fighter could cost as much as a small villa. The schools that produced them, the ludi, were businesses. Brutal businesses, but businesses nonetheless. The lanistei who ran them understood incentive structures. They understood that men who lived daily with the possibility of death in front of screaming crowds needed pressure valves, needed to feel powerful somewhere, needed to be reminded they were still alive. The female prisoners provided that function. They were war captives, debtors, criminals, daughters of executed enemies. They arrived in Rome through the same channels that supplied the empire with labor for its fields and mines and brothels. Some were purchased specifically for gladiatorial schools. Others were assigned there by the state as part of the logistical apparatus that kept the games running. The official records called them servants, attendants, property of the ludus. Their actual role was never written down because it didn't need to be. Everyone understood. Roman culture made a performance of virtue. The Senate debated morality. Poets celebrated feminine modesty. The ideal Roman woman was supposed to be chaste, obedient, devoted to household gods. But that ideal only applied to citizen women, to the daughters and wives of Romans. Enslaved women existed outside the moral framework entirely. There was no honor to protect because the law had already defined them as objects. This wasn't hypocrisy in the Roman mind, it was category distinction. The same society that praised virtue in citizens saw nothing contradictory about the systematic exploitation of the enslaved. The categories simply didn't overlap. At night, when the city slept, the gladiatorial schools were small kingdoms ruled by violence. The gladiators lived in cells, trained in courtyards, ate together in silence. They were prisoners themselves, most of them, enslaved, condemned, or desperately poor men who had sold themselves into the arena. But within the hierarchy of the ludus, they occupied a higher tier than the women. They had status, recognition. The crowd knew their names. Children imitated their fighting styles. Women in the stands threw flowers. That intoxication of fame, even the dark fame of the arena, created a sense of entitlement. Combined with the constant proximity to death, the psychological brutality of their training, the dehumanization required to kill strangers for entertainment, it produced men who had learned to feel nothing except survival and dominance. The female prisoners had no names the crowd would remember, no status, no protection. When a gladiator entered their quarters, there was no authority to appeal to. The lanista wouldn't intervene. Why would he? The gladiator was the asset. The woman was disposable, replaceable. Another would arrive with the next shipment of captives. The system had abundance. It could afford waste. You feel the footsteps before you hear them. The torchlight shifts. Someone is coming down the corridor. Your heart is beating so hard it hurts. There is nowhere to go. The cell door is iron and locked, and you've already tested it 100 times. There are other women here, pressed against the walls, trying to be invisible, trying to be nothing. Because maybe if you're nothing, you'll be overlooked. But you already know that's not how this works. You knew it the moment they brought you here, the moment you saw the way the guards looked through you, the moment you understood that you had entered a place where the rules of the world above didn't apply. The historical evidence for all of this exists in fragments. A graffito in Pompeii names a gladiator and describes his conquests, both in the arena and out of it. Legal documents reference the presence of female servants in gladiatorial barracks. Medical texts discuss injuries common among enslaved women in these environments. Satirists mock wealthy Romans who visited the ludi to watch fighters train, and they make jokes about what else happened in those spaces. The jokes are brief. Oblique. Everyone understood the punchline without it being explained. That's how normalized it was. Roman historians documented battles, political intrigues, the rise and fall of emperors. They described gladiatorial games in obsessive detail when those games served as political commentary. But the women in the system, they appear as background details, as property being moved, as costs in account books. The empire kept meticulous records of grain shipments and tax revenues and military supplies, but the violence done to enslaved women wasn't recorded because it wasn't considered violence. It was use, like using a tool or consuming a resource. The absence in the historical record isn't proof it didn't happen. It's proof of how completely the system denied these women's humanity. Some gladiators died in the arena and were celebrated as heroes. Some won their freedom after years of survival and retired to open their own schools, perpetuating the cycle. A few became famous enough that their names survived 2,000 years. Their armor is in museums. Their stories are taught to children. But the women who existed in the same spaces, who endured the same system from a position of even greater vulnerability, they left almost nothing behind. No names, no monuments, no stones carved with their stories. Just the gaps in the record where their voices should be. Rome tried to hide this, not through conspiracy, but through indifference. The empire didn't need to actively conceal what it never acknowledged as significant. The machinery of spectacle, the celebration of martial virtue, the grandeur of the Colosseum, all of that existed on the surface, visible, glorious. The exploitation that enabled it happened in the spaces Rome didn't consider worth documenting, in the cells and the corners and the long nights after the crowds went home. The truth is that the gladiatorial games were never just about combat, they were about power, about demonstrating Rome's dominance over the conquered, the enslaved, the disposable. Every person in that arena, performing or watching or being used behind the scenes, was part of a system designed to reinforce hierarchy. The games didn't hide Rome's brutality, they celebrated it. They just didn't celebrate all of it equally. If you want to keep uncovering the buried truths behind history's greatest empires, the stories they carved in marble and the ones they left in shadows, stay with us here on Beyond the Ages. Because the past isn't just what they wanted us to remember, it's also everything they hoped we'd forget.